Spirit of the living God, fall fresh on us.
Spirit of the living God, fall fresh on us.
God did not send the Son into the world to condemn the world. This is the judgment, that the light has come into the world. Growing up, I wanted to be a police officer. I always liked the excitement of police shows, most especially the police chases. My favorite police shows growing up were Adam 12 and Car 54. That's really pushing me back, right? Must be some East Coast people here. Adam 12 took place in Los Angeles, and Car 54 took place in New York City. In neither show did the police ever draw their weapons. Adam 12 and Car 54 rescued people in trouble. Over the last few years, my favorite police show is Flashpoint out of Toronto. Flashpoint is about a strategic response unit, or SRU. SRU is the unit called to hostage situations in Toronto. The show always starts with a hostage situation, and the hot call goes out to SRU, and they get back into their black expedition cars and race through downtown Toronto to the scene. Starts the same way every show, and the storyline goes exactly the same way. Stephanie is absolutely amazed that this holds my interest for the over 200 shows that are in the series. But life is complicated enough, and I enjoy the simplicity of this show. As soon as SRU gets to the scene, the head of SRU and the team leader sets up communications to talk to the person who's taken the hostages. The first communications go like this. It's like this in every show. I've watched over 100 shows now. Don't call me at 10 o'clock at night, because this is what I'm doing on Netflix. Goes like this. Hi, I'm Sergeant Greg Parker, head of the Strategic Response Unit. What's your name? Sometimes the perpetrator says their name, but more often than not, they say, I don't want to talk to you. Then Sergeant Greg Parker says, okay, I understand. I hear you are angry. Do you want to tell me about it? No, the person usually says, just listen to my demands. You have an hour to get me what I want, or I'm going to kill my first hostage. Then Sergeant Parker says, okay, try to stay calm. We want everybody to go home safe tonight. And even though SRU is decked out in the latest armed technology, these officers became cops because they wanted to keep the peace. A different guy, a classmate of mine growing up, always wanted to be a police officer. My classmate wanted to be a police officer, he said, I recall, so that he could carry a gun and keep people in line, and if they got out of line, he'd shoot them. Eventually, this fellow applied to be a police officer in the New York Police Academy. It should not surprise you that he did not pass his psychological exam. There are many reasons why we all grew up and chose different professions and different jobs. I think there's always a story for why we choose the path we did. A friend's daughter, a friend of mine who I used to work with in Chicago, a consultant, his daughter became an ER doctor because when she was 4 years old, she had a life-threatening illness that just came upon her one day, and she was taken to the ER. She was terrified, as her parents were terrified. And at the ER, she was taken care of by a young, compassionate doctor, woman doctor. And after that, my friend's daughter, from the time she was 5 years old, wanted to be an ER doctor. And today, She is a doctor at the same Chicago hospital where she was treated. I almost died when my mom gave birth to me, and I received an emergency baptism at the hospital. I was named after Father Joe, the priest who gave me the emergency baptism. The way we know, love, and serve God has a lot to do with the way you and I think and feel that God knows and loves us. The way we interpret today's gospel, and indeed why Jesus came into the world, will have a lot to do with our image of God. I would go as far to say that the way we live in the world, the jobs we pick, and why we pick them has something to do with the way you and I experience God. When people see God as a policeman who is the law enforcer, that's one model. God could be also a strict father who we fear. I remember my dad. My dad was 57 years old, 58 years old, and he could still remember his father disciplining him as a young man. And he was proud of that, but with a scar left on him. For some, God protects, and for others, God is a friend. If we see God as a judge, we will probably live in fear of God. With God as judge, it is important to keep all the rules. By not breaking God's rules, we will not trigger God's anger. Living this way, it is easy to live in constant fear and anxiety. If we see God as loving, then we do our best to live in companionship with God. We trust God's care for us through the Word, through sacraments, baptism, and Eucharist, and through our fellowship and ministry. Our image and relationship with God shape the person we are in life. Jesus' image changed others. Listen to the way Pedro Arrupe, a Jesuit spiritual guide, once wrote. He writes, "I would like to meet you as you really are, since your image changes those with whom you come into contact. Remember John the Baptist's first meeting with you, the centurion's feeling of unworthiness, and the amazement of all those who saw miracles and other wonders, how you impressed your disciples, the rabble in the Garden of Olives, Pilate and his wife, and the centurion at the foot of the cross. And I add, remember the way Jesus treated the thief on the cross next to him. Remember the way Jesus treated Peter. Even after Peter denied him 3 times, Jesus still had a very special role for Peter. Remember the story of the prodigal son and the love the father had for both sons. Jesus did not condemn Pilate, Peter, or the thief. He brought light to Pilate, Peter, and the thief. And those are only 3 stories. You know many more stories where the same is true. Pilate rejected the light and so condemned himself. Peter and the thief accepted the light and left their own self-made darkness as they trusted Jesus' invitation. Jesus changed Peter's life. The thief, Jesus promised, would enter the kingdom of God. Our lives are changed when we accept the light of God and live with God's heart of compassion and love. Even more importantly, we change lives when you and I try to be and live like Jesus. Okay, I told you about my police shows up front, so I'm going to wrap up or move towards the close today by offering you a confession. You know I do that from time to time. So here it is. I'm not very streetwise. That probably doesn't come to you as a surprise. I have enormous respect for priests and deacons who are streetwise. And I must admit, that Stephanie, my beloved Stephanie, in her own way is streetwise. She didn't grow up that way. She grew up in beautiful Paradise, Santa Barbara, which is hardly the greatest preparation for becoming streetwise. But she worked at urban parishes in the coldest, darkest, and most unemployed sections of Manchester, England, and then in an urban parish as rector in Reno. And she got very good at knowing when street people shared their honest needs and when they were telling a fabricated story to move the heart of a priest. But this priest, Stephanie, she developed some skills in this area. Joe, on the other hand, in the course of my priesthood, has tended not to give handouts to the homeless, as I never knew who to trust and who not to trust. And here at St. Francis, I have given to more people than I ever have before at any other time in my priesthood. I give because the Saint Francis was always about mercy and love to those in need, and the charism of this parish very much lives in the shadows of St. Francis. This past week, I gave some money to a young man who came to the office at about 5:30 p.m. when I was in a meeting planning the Easter Vigil with some pastors and musicians, including Tom. The fellow who came to the door was just released from a psychiatric facility at Kaiser and needed gas money for his car. His story seemed to be a good one, but I had no idea. He had paperwork from Kaiser, he had his medications from Kaiser, he had it signed off by doctors, and I was in the middle of a meeting, I wanted to get back to the meeting, but he kept on talking, kept telling me his story. He said he'd pay me back, but I wasn't worried. I gave him money. I suspect that he will forget me pretty quickly, but he is very likely to remember that when he came to this church, that we helped him out. And that has been consistently my experience here at St. Francis. While I narrated that in my head this week, in prior weeks and prior gifts, I knew that instinctively. And I have noticed in the course of my priestly ministry that people tend to have very long memories about what churches do and do not do for them. Indeed, they rarely remember what you do for them, but they remember what you don't do for them, and people get angry, especially when people are downing out. Their one last hope is that the church will be there in some small way. I had Jesuit friends who always gave something to every street person that asked for help. Sometimes he gave the homeless person a cup of coffee and not money, but he always gave some indication that he heard their need and that he cared. My friend brought light into the world. He never condemned anyone by ignoring their needs. My final story for the morning. At Archbishop Rowan Williams' installation as Archbishop of Canterbury some decade ago, during the procession in Canterbury Cathedral, a homeless man interrupted the procession into the cathedral. You can imagine, the security team raced to get rid of him from the procession. What happened next might surprise you. The Archbishop broke the procession, told the homeless man that after the service he would talk with him, and he did. Archbishop Williams treated the homeless man like he thought Jesus would have. The Archbishop did not condemn him. He showed him the light. No doubt the Archbishop's gesture of compassion had a lasting impact on the homeless man, the security officer, and the bishops, and indeed the young priest who 5 years later told me the story as if it happened yesterday. How do we sum all this up? I think it's pretty simple. Condemnation begets more condemnation. Light begets more light. And Jesus is always about the light. So let us continue to follow Jesus and bring light into the world by the way you and I choose to act with one another and to those who express their needs to us. God bless you.